The order gave the world's tanker owners about 24 hours. At 4 in the afternoon, Eastern Time, the United States switched the blockade of Iran's ports back on, by order of the president. Every ship bound for an Iranian port had one afternoon to change its mind. It was the fourth consecutive day of American strikes on Iran, and it landed 3 days before the deadline by which Washington had promised in writing to have that same blockade completely gone. It was the second American blockade of Iran's ports this year. The first ran about 2 months and ended in a signed agreement. The second came back while the clock on that agreement was still running, and Kepler tracked 21 transits through the Strait of Hormuz as it took effect. 26 days separate the two. Inside them, Washington worked a panel. The blockade came off. An American license to sell Iranian oil came on and then came off. A fee on every cargo crossing the strait was announced one day and abandoned the next. Then, the blockade came back ahead of the clause that governed it by presidential order at the hour the order named. Every one of those moves was reversible, and not one of them carried a wind down. What Tehran has to price now is not the line in the water. It is the speed at which that line appears and disappears. None of those switches was new. American naval interdiction has always been a switch, and the men who threw it knew exactly what they were touching. What used to come attached to it was a calendar. If this kind of breakdown is useful so far, a quick like genuinely helps the channel. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The word was a choice, not a description. At an executive committee meeting on October 19th, the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor had proposed replacing blockade with defensive quarantine, because a blockade in law presupposes a state of war, and the administration wanted an act that stopped short of one. The State Department's own history records the substitution. And when Moscow agreed to withdraw its IL-28 bombers, Kennedy ended the quarantine the same way he had begun it, by presidential decision on November 20th. A generation later, the same fleet ran the same water with the polarity reversed. Kuwait asked for American protection in December 1986. The executive branch approved the reflagging of Kuwaiti tankers on March 7, 1987, and Operation Earnest Will ran from July 24, 1987 to September 26, 1988, the largest American naval convoy operation since the Second World War, consuming as many as 30 Navy ships at once, escorting instead of interdicting on a decision, for as long as the decision held. And when Washington reversed itself on paper rather than at sea, it still moved slowly. On May 8, 2018, President Trump announced the American withdrawal from the nuclear agreement through National Security Presidential Memorandum 11. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, built the reimposition around wind-down periods of 90 and 180 days. The sanctions covering Iranian ports, energy, shipping, and petroleum returned in full on November 5, 2018, 181 days after the announcement. That was the standard. Reversal with a calendar attached. Price it from a shipowner's chair for a second. 181 days is a business plan, and 24 hours is a phone call in the dark. In July of 2026, the calendar was 24 hours. The window that closed on July 14th had opened with a signature. On June 17, 2026, the United States and Iran signed the Memorandum of Islamabad, a 14-point framework as described in the published analysis of the law firm Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. 2 of its paragraphs govern everything that followed. Paragraph 4 bound the United States to begin removing the blockade immediately upon signature and to have it entirely gone within 30 days. Paragraph 3 set a ceiling of 60 days to negotiate the final agreement, extendable by mutual consent, a clock on the talks, and not on the shooting. Central Command suspended the blockade of Iranian ports on June 18th, 1 day after the signing. The removal was written to be gradual, spread across a month. It took an afternoon. What that opening was worth showed up in the tanker traffic within a week. Kepler put Iranian crude and condensate exports at roughly 1.7 million barrels a day before the war and near zero through May and the first half of June. Loading resumed at Karg Island on June 20th after about 6 weeks of silence, with 3 very large crude carriers alongside, identified by Bloomberg from Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 satellite imagery. Karg moves close to 90% of Iran's oil. 2 days later, OFAC issued General License X, temporarily authorizing the sale of Iranian oil and petrochemicals. by the count of United Against Nuclear Iran, the June export average closed at 1.75 million barrels a day. Then, the window came apart, and it came apart from both ends. It did not fail on one side of the line. The same tracking by United Against Nuclear Iran logs, attacks by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, on commercial shipping on June 25th and 27th, and again on the 6th and 7th of July. Washington revoked General License X on the 7th. Across the 7th and 8th, American forces struck more than 80 targets inside Iran, including air defense sites, coastal radars, and more than 60 IRGC fast attack boats, according to Central Command's own account of what it had hit. Each side accused the other of breaking the memorandum. On July 13th, Central Command announced the return, and by 4 the following afternoon, the blockade was back in force, 3 days before paragraph 4 said it should have finished disappearing. On that same day, the president abandoned a 20% fee on cargo transiting the Strait that he had announced only the day before, replacing it with investment arrangements with Gulf states in a post on his own platform reported by Fox News. Announced one day, gone the next. Tehran keeps a different ledger of those weeks. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has argued that the memorandum gives Iran the right to define the routes and mechanisms of transit through the Strait, and that Washington should have consulted Tehran before forcing a new one. Speaking to the state broadcaster, IRIB, in remarks reported by CNN, he called the obstacle the irrational, excessive, and hegemonic approach of the US, the foreign minister of one party to the fight characterizing the other. Iranian state television has also reported that the IRGC fired warning shots to stop 4 vessels inside a single day in the southern corridor. That count comes from the force doing the firing. Both governments can argue the paperwork. Neither of them can argue the water. A blockade is a physical instrument, and the Strait of Hormuz sets hard limits on what any instrument there can do. Even the width is contested. The International Energy Agency records 29 nautical miles at the narrowest point, while other standard references work from 21. The usable part is narrower still, a traffic separation scheme of 2 lanes, 2 miles wide each, 1 in each direction, split by a 2-mile buffer, all of it inside Omani territorial waters. On an ordinary day, between 130 and 160 vessels move through that corridor, carrying somewhere near 20 million barrels of oil. The second round of enforcement runs on the force the war zone described on July 20th. The aircraft carriers, USS Abraham Lincoln and USS George H.W. Bush, an amphibious ready group built around the USS Boxer, and roughly 14 destroyers. Central Command's own figure on July 14th was more than 20 warships and hundreds of aircraft across the Middle East. In the first round, there were 3 carriers in the region, the largest concentration in some 23 years by Central Command's description. The USS Gerald R. Ford went home and into maintenance on July 7th. The procedure is far simpler than the hardware. Central Command instructed merchant vessels approaching the Gulf of Oman and the Strait to call American naval forces on bridge-to-bridge Channel 16. The declared scope covers only ships sailing to or from Iranian ports. Transit to third countries is not touched. Whether any of it is lawful depends on which professor you ask. James Krasker, who teaches international maritime law at the Naval War College, holds that it is. The law of naval warfare applies wherever armed conflict exists between states, declared or not, under Common Article 2 of the Geneva Conventions. Mark Nevitt, a professor at Emory and a retired Navy JAG commander, reads it the other way. A blockade is a belligerent act that formally ends a ceasefire, and a blockade that does not work fails militarily and legally at the same time. Effectiveness is testable. Someone tested it. Lloyd's List Intelligence counted at least 26 vessels, tied to Iran's shadow fleet, crossing the blockade line in both directions during the first round, in a tally closed on April 20th, 7 days after enforcement began. 12 of them crossed after the scope was widened on April 16th, 5 eastbound and 7 westbound. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell called the report false. Central Command's own 2-month balance for that round was more than 140 ships redirected, 9 disabled, and more than 50 humanitarian vessels released. Those are the enforcing party's figures for the enforcing party's work. The money is harder to pin down than either side lets on. On April 22nd, the president wrote that the blockade was costing Iran $500 million a day, his claim on his own platform reported by Forbes. The Defense Department estimated Iranian oil revenue losses at $4.8 billion through May 1st. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank with a declared hard line on Tehran, recorded Iranian seaborne oil exports falling to 64,000 barrels a day against 2.1 million in February. On the American side, the Center for Strategic and International Studies priced Operation Epic Fury at roughly $900 million a day, mostly munitions, built up from Congressional Budget Office, operating and support costs. What none of those numbers isolate is the blockade itself. Every published figure covers the entire air and naval campaign around it. The cost of simply holding the line is not a number anyone has produced. What the line does produce is measurable, and it is modest. Central Command's balance for the second round through July 25th was 12 vessels redirected, 2 disabled, and 2 boarded. On July 14th, the day the blockade came back, Kepler tracked 21 transits through the Strait. On the 24th, the Mozambique-flagged tanker MT Levine was disabled in the Gulf of Oman after repeated attempts to run the line, again by Central Command's account of its own operation. 12 ships in 11 days in a waterway that moves 130 to 160 hulls on an ordinary day. The instrument is aimed at a narrow slice of that traffic, and even inside that slice it squeezes. It does not seal. So the 26 days end up carrying more weight than the blockade ever did. Naval interdiction has been switched on and off by American decision since a president picked a word to keep a quarantine short of war. What changed in the summer of 2026 was the interval. The blockade came off in a day. The license followed, and then the license was pulled. The blockade came back. The transit fee arrived and vanished. That is not a button. That is a panel, worked in the open at a tempo that leaves no room for anyone to wind down anything. Whether that serves American interests is genuinely contested. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies argues that negotiating in the middle of active hostilities gives Washington more leverage to raise the price of Iranian intransigence. Responsible Statecraft argues from the other end that repeated American reversals have taught Tehran a lasting lesson. American promises are reversible, American commitments are contingent. There is a mechanism underneath that argument. Every coercive threat carries an implicit promise that the pain is avoidable, the assurance half of coercion. When only the threat is credible, the target concludes it will suffer either way and stops paying for relief it does not expect to keep. Iran is already routing around the question. With the blockade running the length of its southern coast and its rail link to Turkmenistan damaged, the Caspian is now the only heavy cargo corridor left under Iranian sovereignty. On July 25th, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, said it had struck an Iranian vessel carrying military cargo between Iran and Russia there. Tehran called it a commercial ship loaded with iron on the Astrakhan to Anzali Run, and reported 1 seafarer killed and 3 injured. Bijan Kajapur of Eurasian Nexus Partners puts that corridor where the geography puts it, a complement to Iran's southern access, not a replacement for it. The blockade was never the asset. The asset is the panel behind it, and the proof, now on the record and inside 26 days, that Washington will work those switches within a day, with no wind down, no notice worth the name, and no reluctance to beat by 3 days a deadline it wrote itself.